we have to be careful not to allow those hurts and those differences to drive wedges in our relationships in here. We must not allow arguments to fester and break apart our church. We can't take our focus off our great example, who, as he hung on that cross, asked God to forgive the people that put him there. We have to cherish our relationships with one another. We can't let squabbles keep us from our mission. Our mission is not to get resolutions to biblical mysteries, right? It is to love one another and to spread the good news, the news that I am not perfect, but I am saved by the one who is. Today we continue to go through our book of Acts. We've been working through that for quite a while. At this point today in our text, we're about halfway through the book of Acts, and I assume we'll continue through the book of Acts till we're done. And this is the piece that God has provided for us today. This is what Josh asked me to preach on. It was a little bit of a struggle for me to do this, but it pushed me, and I'm so thankful that I get to do this and bring this to y'all this morning. Last week, if you were here, Dr. K preached on the long process that led up to where we are today in the book of Acts with his go, no-go sermon. I would encourage you, if you weren't here last week, that you go back and listen to it. It was a great lesson on our church history. I love history, so I can sit around and listen to a lot of history. I know a lot of people don't love history. It kind of bores them or whatever. But it was a good look into the Council of Jerusalem and what a pivotal point that was in our church history. How prior to that there was this kind of hang-up on, are the Gentiles allowed, are they not allowed, which that's all of us. We're all the Gentiles. And it's because of the work that Paul did that he really stood his ground on, like, no, they're to be included in this. And they make their final ruling on the Gentiles to quit trying to yoke everybody to the old Jewish law that none of the Jews could stand up to anyways, and to entrust ourselves and commend ourselves to the grace of the Lord, to put our faith in the sacrifice Christ made for all of us, Jew and Gentile. As we have worked our way through the book of Acts, we have seen some rough patches that the early church had to iron out in order to have the clarity that we all benefit from today in our church. And I'm thankful for the people that God put in those roles. They were instrumental in forming the church and our message that we have. The message that we share today, a message of salvation. Salvation that is given to us by God through Christ because of the Lord's abundant grace, mercy, and love for us. It is that example of grace and love that I believe our text is trying to point out to us today. And it is pointing it out in a way that can be uncomfortable for us to look at, by forcing us to look at ugliness between two brothers, by seeing two brothers not glorify God by how they're behaving, by forcing us to look at ourselves and our actions with one another and ask, have I glorified God in my relationships with other people in this church? So let's look at the text here. We're going to start in 36 and I'll read through 41. I won't ask you to stand. It's a little long. Not as long as some of them have been, but. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they are. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them the one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia. I was going to ask for sure how to say that, but I didn't. And had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. God bless the reading of his word. So we have to ask, why did Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, inspired by the Holy Spirit, include this kind of airing out of this event that happens, this kind of ugliness between two brothers? And I believe it's so we can pause in our studying of church history, if you will, and check in with ourselves by forcing us to ask the question, am I glorifying God in the way I interact with my church family? First off, I felt important, though, to give a little backstory on who we're talking about. Kind of in this corner, if you will. Maybe a bad joke. So, to start with, we have Paul, right? Paul, if you don't know, I'll give you a little backstory on Paul. Paul, formerly Saul, who encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, who was blinded by Jesus, who prior to this was hunting Christians and persecuting them, killing them, having them imprisoned. He was actively doing this. This is who Paul was. He encounters Jesus on the road. He's blinded, and he does a 180 in his life. He's convicted by Jesus. Jesus speaks to him and asks him, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting my people? He does a 180, and he becomes one of the most instrumental people in the founding of the early church. If you ever wonder, have I sinned too much to get salvation? Just look at Paul. He's about the best human example of conviction changing your life that you can find, to go from persecuting and murdering Christians to becoming a Christian. He wrote 8 of the New Testament books. Thanks, Dad, for telling me that one. He was sent out by the early church on basically the first mission. He planted churches. He included Gentiles, which is all of us, into this new church. He was persecuted himself, he was stoned, and he was eventually killed for this. So that's Paul. Then we have Barnabas, who is described as the son of encouragement. When you read about Barnabas, he just sounds like the most kindest, positive, encouraging person that you could meet, that you would hope to find in a church. The very person that once Paul decided to change his life spoke up for Paul and said, I think he's genuine in this. The church was scared that he was a spy and that he was trying to find out more about them so he could put them in prison. And it was Barnabas who stuck his neck out for him and said, no, I think he's genuinely changed. In Acts 11, verse 24, it describes Barnabas as a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and full of faith. It is Barnabas who was sent out with Paul on the first mission with Paul when he is stoned in Lystra. And at this point in our text, these two have been together for several years now, and they have been through a lot. It's safe to say that Paul and Barnabas are closer than anyone in this church. They've been persecuted together. They've done all of this stuff trying to build the church together. And then we have the third person in this text that we read about, John Mark. I learned a lot about John Mark going through this that I did not know. So he accompanied Paul and Barnabas on their first mission, but he left early. We don't know why. We don't know why he left. We don't really ever get an explanation. We just know that he left. But John Mark is the person who wrote the book of Mark. I didn't know that. He wasn't just some guy. Like he was basically discipled by Peter, and Peter brought him along, and it's through Peter's firsthand account that John Mark, was able to write the book of Mark, one of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. So he's a very important person. And then we have Silas, who we read more about in the weeks to come, was a prominent leader and accompanies Paul on his second mission trip. But I mainly want to focus on Paul, Barnabas, and Mark. I feel it's important to point out who these men were. And we should talk about them with respect and reverence because of what they did for us. But I wanted to point out that they weren't just three guys who made a proclamation and got into a fight. These were three of the best examples and some of the three most important people to the early church that we can find. Men who were Christians in a time and a place where it was very dangerous to have a proclamation of that faith. And even in the midst of who they are, even with their resumes, they were human and they made mistakes, just like all of us today. And we see that they are in need of grace from God and from each other, just like we are. It shows us that even the best of us fall short. So as we look into this, I want us all to give ourselves grace because we all screw up. Let us look at verse 36 to begin with. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." To me, that verse shows a lot of excitement in Paul. He's excited to go back and see the progress that the church has made. Have you ever had an idea that you've brought to somebody in the church and you've been excited about a plan you've made for it to only get messed up, right? How many times do we feel like we get some momentum going only to have the devil root his way in there and mess it up for us? You had a plan, you had an idea, you were excited, no one helps, no one joins in, no one signs up, people are negative. That hurts, right? That hurts all of us when that happens. We see here that at the beginning, they are fired up. Paul's ready to go look back at everybody. They are having what I would call a good spirit day, right? Sometimes we feel like we're having that. We're reading our Bible, we're praying all the time, we're fasting, we are locked in, right? We're having a good spirit day. We're bringing things to the church, we're serving, right? We feel good. What happens? We relax, we don't pray as much, we don't read as much, we fall back into what we were doing prior. We start having bad spirit days or months, or maybe it turns into years, right? Not praying, not reading, not fasting, being negative, right? We are all in these cycles together at the same time. We're all trying to figure this out together. And that's why the texts like this are so important, because we have to check in where we're at, right? We can't relax. We can't take a day off. We can't sit back and think, well, I read yesterday, so I'm good. No, we have to keep trying to get better, right? That is why how we handle our relationships with one another is so important, because we need one another. I need to have my relationship in a place with you where I can say, "Hey, Dwayne, are you okay?" Or Dwayne can ask me, "Hey, what's going on with you?" Right? That's what we need. That's where we need to be at with one another. We have to have one another. The next part I want us to look at is putting our attention on verse 39, right? This is where it gets hard. And there arose a sharp disagreement. We have so many questions with this verse, right? Why did Mark leave in the first place? Back in chapter 13, we don't know. Was Paul holding a grudge here? You know, how bad was this fight? Were they like yelling at each other? What did they say in the fight? Who was in the right? What does verse 40 mean, right? There's all these questions that we don't really have answers to, and we won't get answers to. But as humans, we want to know the dirt, right? We want to go back to our human nature and think, okay, well, who was at fault? I want a resolution, right? Sometimes we don't get that. Especially we especially want the dirt when it involves someone who we view as righteous or has more together than maybe we do, right? But that sort of gossip is wrong. It's evil. It is the devil trying to work his way into our thoughts, and we cannot be seeking shortcomings amongst our brothers and sisters. When I first started working on this sermon, I thought I could see that Paul was holding a grudge. And I thought, so, Paul, he had some shortcomings and that he had to work through, you know. It's kind of silly that I could feel that way about Paul, but I found myself judging Paul, right? You see, we want to feel justified in our sin. We look for the sins of the righteous to try to make ourselves feel better. After sitting on this for a while, I thankfully reached out to Josh because I wanted to get a little validation on my theory, right? Oh yeah, and if you can get someone else to partner with you, we can both feel better about our sin, right? Both these examples are small, but without an honest check-in, they can grow into something much worse. But when I told Josh my theory, he saw it different than I did. Now in that, Josh and I could have gotten into a big fight. We could have gotten into an argument about this whole thing, right? But he helped me to see that building a sermon on Paul holding a grudge was probably a bad idea. And more importantly, what was God trying to show us as a congregation? Was he trying to show us that we're not perfect? I don't think so. We all know that anyways. Or that we're going to have disagreements and we are going to hurt one another. But it is how we handle those situations that is important. I don't know that Josh and I still agree on exactly whose fault it is. And if I asked all of you, there would probably be multiple ideas on that. And after we wrote down everyone's opinion, we would still not know for sure. We could break up into groups of 10 and sit and discuss verse 40 alone for 2 hours and come to this conclusion. We didn't have a clear answer, and if we argued and were disrespectful to one another in the process, we did more harm than good, right? We could get caught up in something that doesn't matter, and if we handle it in a way that does not honor God, it could lead to real problems in our church and even our own spiritual lives. About 9 years ago, when my daughter and my brother's kids were very young, I got into a fight with my brother, and I still regret it. I've always looked up to my brother. Growing up, we were close. We never fought. I just wanted to be around him. If you've ever seen the movie A River Runs Through It, there's this great scene where the two brothers get in this fist fight, and it says in there that when brothers reach a certain point, they either stop fighting or they continue to fight the rest of their adult lives. But that was me and my brother. We never fought much before, and we certainly never fought much in our adult lives. As we became adults, we became very close. He's one of my best friends, still to this day. It's a relationship I cherish. I am not the best at dealing with my anger. Me and Ursula joke, she's like black cats, you know. You light one, it pops over there, and you know, in 10 minutes it's gone, right? It's just constant, two. Me, I'm more like a nuclear bomb. You put it in a silo for 20 years, and then when it goes off, it causes a lot of problems, right? I was a young parent, and when you're a young parent, you think no one knows more about a baby than you do, right? Especially your own baby. And you think you have it all figured out as a young parent. Of course, I'm sure that people are probably older than me in their 60s and 70s are going to look at me at 40 and think, well, you still don't have it figured out. And I'll admit I do not now. I know that for a fact. But when you're that young, you think you know. You think you know how to handle things. And me and my brother got into a disagreement, a silly argument about how we were parenting our children. We got into a huge fight over it. And I handled it very poorly. I cussed him out. I called him terrible names. It was awful. And I almost ruined that entire relationship over something silly. And because I spent years not communicating things that were bothering me to him. Okay? We didn't talk for months, which is unusual for us. We generally at least talk once a week. And I was in the wrong. It was completely my fault. I had blown up, and I had made this into a way bigger thing than it should have. And my brother had to show me a tremendous amount of grace to reconcile our relationship. And thankfully, he did. He forgave me. And I'm so glad that he did. And it was my fault. And I cherished that relationship, and I almost destroyed it by not communicating well and letting little things compound into big things. And I certainly did not honor God in the way that I handled it. We have to honor God, and maybe even more importantly, during disagreements we have with one another. So back to our group of 10 discussions. After 2 hours, if we deliberated, I would hope what we would realize is that none of us are perfect. And we all need God's grace. And we all have to work to give that grace to one another. That we don't get hung up on petty arguments, hung up on gossip, hung up on who's right and who's wrong, hung up to the point that we dishonor God by our actions. We have to be careful not to allow those hurts and those differences to drive wedges in our relationships in here. We must not allow arguments to fester and break apart our church. We can't take our focus off our great example, who as he hung on that cross, asked God to forgive the people that put him there. We have to cherish our relationships with one another. We can't let squabbles keep us from our mission. Our mission is not to get resolutions to biblical mysteries, right? It is to love one another and to spread the good news, the news that I am not perfect, but I am saved by the one who is. Paul and Barnabas didn't. They did not let this incident knock them off their mission. It tells us that they went off strengthening the churches. We can also find comfort in even in this broken world with broken humans, God is still in control. Even though an incident like this happens, God's will is still done and the church grew. The word was spread. We are the Gentiles in Haskell, Texas, and we're proof of God's will. We're proof that this thing went on after this little fight, right? So we can take comfort in that and be gracious to one another. And keep your focus on Christ and our commission. I used the story of my brother because my wife suggested it to me, but also because I have not yet been greatly hurt by someone in the church. And I say yet because I'm sure I will be. Or worse, I'll hurt or offend someone else. And I pray that when that happens, the Lord gives me grace to honor Him in my actions. We are not perfect. This world is broken. But we have one another. So I encourage you today, if there is a brother or a sister who has offended you or you feel you have offended, go talk to them today. Don't let it fester. Give them grace. Forgive, right? And pray for one another. Do it today. Honor God in how we behave with one another in here. If we can't do it in here, we won't be able to do it out there.